Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're joined by a wonderful guest who wrote a book called An Improbable Friendship. It's the remarkable lives of Israeli Ruth Dayan and Palestinian Raymonda Tawil and their 40-year peace mission. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest who has written 8 books, including his collaboration with the Palestinian leader Sari Naziba and his autobiography, Once Upon a Country and Palestinian Life. It was voted one of the best books of the year by both Christian Science Monitor and Amazon.com. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Anthony David. Anthony, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted.
Now, you live pretty much in the Middle East, so, for somebody who has a PhD in European history, there must be quite an interest over there for you.
Well, I first became intrigued with Israel, actually, when I was doing research for my dissertation on European German Jews. And I decided to do a project on the German intellectuals, writers, poets, musicians, and others who immigrated to Palestine in 1933 to 1939 or 40 and began rebuilding their lives here. And so I left Berlin, where I was studying, and I came to Tel Aviv, and I began doing my research, and I found that the place was so compelling, so troubled, but also so compelling that it was hard for me to leave. And so I've spent most of my time since the year 2000 here.
Now, the story that you have written here, it's pretty much kind of like an autobiography in a way, but it's about these 2 women who forged a friendship that lasted more than 40 years who are really on different sides of the fence when it comes to the Middle Eastern conflict. Well,
the unusual thing, and I like your metaphor of the fence, because there is a physical wall that separates Palestinians and Israelis today. In fact, I passed through it today, going from the West Bank to Nazareth, where I am now. It's an interesting metaphor because Ruth and Raymonda share many, many things, and they share not only affection and love and history, but they share a common understanding of the source of the conflict and the way the conflict can be surmounted and overcome. Another irony of this whole story is that her Moshe Dayan's nephew actually built the wall that I crossed through today, in which separates Palestinians and Israelis, and which symbolizes for both Ruth and Raymonda what really needs to come down if two sides are going to bury the hatchet and learn to live in a collaborative win-win basis.
Now, what has been, for listeners who may not be completely familiar with the conflict between these 2 factions, the reason that it exists in the first place?
Well, it goes way back, not 2,000 years, but 100 years, when European Jews, feeling anti-Semitism, felt that the best way of solving the problem is to come to their ancient homeland and rebuild their European life here. And at the time, Palestine was controlled by the Turks, and it wasn't much of a problem because there was a lot of land, the population was fairly low, and no one was really thinking about a state at the time. Mm-hmm. The Ottomans were pretty harsh rulers. It was very clear to everyone that the Ottomans weren't going to allow anyone, whether it be Arabs or the Jews, to establish their own independence. So at the time, it wasn't a problem. It only became a serious problem in the 30s, after Hitler came to power in Germany, and it was clear to German Jews, and eventually to Jews everywhere in Europe, that they had to get out, and there weren't many places for them to go. Most countries closed their borders, so Palestine was the most inviting and the most available choice for them. And so 100,000 people immigrated, and at that point, the Palestinians began to feel like their country was being taken from them. And that kind of created the fuel for the first explosion in 1936 between a nationalist movement among the Arabs and the Zionist movement.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I don't think people really understand that, because if it isn't happening in their backyard or directly to them, they kind of become confused and think this was seemingly more of a holy war, which it really wasn't, in fact.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's about land, it's about resources, it's about power, things people fight about all over the world, and they have been for thousands of years, especially men. In this book, the main antagonists are men, and my two protagonists are women, and they approach the conflict in a very different way, in a very empathetic way, which is more likely to find resolution than the male warrior, alpha male approach.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting to talk about who the antagonists are and who these women are directly connected to. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Well, we'll start with Ruth. She's 98 and a half years old, and
wow.
She's still vigorous. Her mind is sharp as a tack. She remembers things that happened to her when she was 4 years old, which was in 1921. And she ended up, as an 18-year-old, marrying a farmer in northern Palestine at the time. His name was Moshe Dayan. And Moshe Dayan came from a family on his father's side of small-town Eastern European peddlers who ended up in Palestine as farmers. And on his mother's side, they were intellectuals. His mother was a mathematician in Kiev. But Moshe was raised without education. He was raised as a farmer. And Ruth, having come from an intellectual family, really wanted to marry a farmer, wanted to live on the land. She was a socialist. She didn't want to own a car like her lawyer parents, didn't want the house that her parents had, wanted to really live a simple life of building the country and having kids, living with her husband. That was her vision. So he very quickly left the farm because in 1936, as I mentioned, there was an uprising, and he became, first of all, a British cop because the British were the colonial powers there, and he joined the Haganah, which was the underground Jewish army, which was initially really a defensive army. It moved over to more offensive actions very soon, and Moshe was very good at it. He was a good commando. So he began rising up the ranks. At the same time, a couple hundred miles away, Raymonda's father was an aristocrat. He was a Christian whose family traces its roots back to Palestine 1,000 years, and his family owned a castle in northern Israel. I'm going to it tomorrow, and thousands of acres. A very large landowner and an extremely educated, a bit pompous, arrogant man, as aristocrats tend to be. That was her father. And in 1936, he decided to throw his weight behind the uprising. So even though he had his Mercedes outside, and he had his castle, and he had his servants and mistresses, he was secretly funding and backing the uprising against the Zionists. Raymonda was born into that family of nationalists who ended up in 1948 losing all of their property, losing the castle and the lands. And her father ended up a pauper. Her mother, a feminist, ended up a seamstress at a school. And Raymonda was raised by nuns in a convent.
Now, how did these?
Go ahead. I could say you could sum up that both families, in a sense, represent the historical roots of their respective societies.
Mm-hmm. Now, how was it these two women came to meet?
Well, in 1967, Moshe Dayan was the Minister of Defense, and he launched a preemptive war against Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And that war quickly became a war against Jordan, which controlled the West Bank, and Syria. And the Israeli army conquered all these armies and conquered the West Bank. And Raymonda, at the time, was married with 5 kids. She was a journalist, but she was one of the very few Palestinians in the West Bank who could speak Hebrew. And so when Moshe's army conquered the West Bank, she could actually talk to the soldiers. She could talk to the women soldiers because the women as well were fighters. And so she, in a sense, was caught in this unusual place where, on the one hand, an enemy came to her back door and took her country, but at the same time, she knew them, she could speak to them, she understood them. And around 3 years later, she went to a hospital to visit children wounded by an Israeli action. Moshe was chasing Yasser Arafat around the West Bank in 1970, and the army wounded these children. So Raymonda went to this hospital. Ruth heard about the children. She went to the hospital, and that's where they met, over the beds of wounded children wounded by her husband. And Raymonda and Ruth had their first encounter that day. Ruth went home that night and asked for a divorce from Moshe. Mm-hmm. That was the first day of their friendship 40 years ago.
Now, what I found interesting, too, just a bit, was the age difference between these two women.
Right. It's Raymonda is the age of Ruth's daughter. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because Ruth is 98 and a half, and Raymonda is a very beautiful 74 years old. So Ruth has a very vigorous mind, but she looks like she's in her 80s. She doesn't look like she's 98. Raymonda looks like she's in her 50s. But their friendship is based less on generational synchronicity than empathy, and like I said, a weird kind of shared memory. Let me just tell you a story. The first time I met the two of them together was in Baltimore, and Raymonda was in Baltimore with one of her daughters, and Ruth and I flew to Baltimore to meet her, and they fell into each other's arms, and they were kissing and laughing and sharing stories and going between English and Hebrew. And after 2 days of watching this love fest and hearing these stories, I asked Raymonda, I said, Raymonda, explain to me, how did you develop this kind of intimacy? Because there are many things you don't agree about. In fact, they fight all the time as well. And Raymonda looked at me and she threw back her head and she laughed and she said, well, let me tell you. The first time I had a conversation with Ruth after the hospital in 1970, I found out who her parents were. And when I found out who her parents were, I knew I could trust them because her parents knew my parents. And they went to the same parties. They belonged to the same social club. They were friends. Because of that, I knew that I could be friends with Ruth. And the reason that struck me was Palestinians and Israelis seemed to share nothing at all. And here these two women were sharing a kind of deep history through their parents of a common country, of dinner parties at one another's homes, at common values, common dreams. Nationalism hadn't yet polluted the country. They were people who were very proud to be Jewish and very proud to be Christian Arabs. At the same time, socially, they didn't see a difference. And Raymonda and Ruth, in a sense, their memories go back to that era of humanism, of liberalism, of openness.
Now, these two women had access to some very powerful men. There's no doubt about that. How were they able to, and did they try to influence their outlook to see about being able to create that peaceful structure they were hoping for?
Well, let's start again with Ruth.
Okay.
Ruth, I would say she didn't have a lot of success with Moshe directly. It was more indirect. Moshe was a warrior. First of all, I'm sure most people know this, but Moshe had an eye patch. He had an eye patch because his eye got shot out in World War II, and shrapnel was lodged into his brain. Ruth is convinced that made him, it exacerbated some of his personality traits that he already had of being a loner, of being melancholy, an aggressive man. And it made him into a man who loved war, really. And so Ruth was a woman who hated war and loved peace. And she was married to this man who not only loved war, but was very, very good at it. And they divorced, but Ruth's influence through their daughter, I think, her daughter Yael, percolated in Moshe's mind. And Moshe eventually came around to a position of embracing the peace accord with Egypt, pushed by Jimmy Carter. And without Moshe Dayan's influence inside the Israeli government at the time, it wouldn't have happened. And so I think Ruth's influence on Moshe was was indirect. Now, she had a much more direct influence on her brother-in-law. Now, her sister married a man named Ezra Weizmann, who eventually became the president of the State of Israel. He as well was a great warrior. He's a pilot, and he started out like Moshe, very much hawkish, very much the warrior. And in his case, he was a right-winger. He helped found the Likud party. He supported Menachem Begin, who was the first really right-wing Israeli prime minister. And yet, through Raymonda and Ruth, he eventually came around to deeply understanding the needs for peace with the Palestinians, so deeply, in fact, that he was willing to talk illegally to Yasser Arafat and the PLO at a time when no one did it. It was taboo. It was against the law. He was a minister in the government. He did something that was really a kind of treason, and he did it because he believed it. He did it because of Ruth and Raymonda, who worked on him in different directions to make him realize that the only way to solve the conflict with the Palestinians is to talk to them, is to give their leaders respect, and to try to find a way through dialogue where cooperation was possible, and where the legacy of hatred and attack would be put to one side.
Mm-hmm. And just to note, too, is the fact that these two women also suffered losses through this war, and it would have been easy for them to take up arms and sides against each other, and actually over the years they had known, as you were writing in the book, been known to kind of, well, let's say cat fight with each other, because even though they would get upset, they tended to be forgiving and say, okay, now let's, kind of move on and look at this thing again.
Yeah, the fact is they agree on the essentials. Now, there are a lot of details they're not going to agree about. Ruth's personality is not political. Ruth has spent, she's so old, 60 years, I would say, 50, 60 years, working with women's groups, both Jewish and non-Jewish, Arab, Christian, Muslim groups, to bring training, education to women, to use their handicrafts very often in producing products that could be sold sometimes on Fifth Avenue by bringing in European designers to take handicraft and turn it into something really beautiful. So she was involved in a movement empowering women for many years. She wasn't, however, political. She was a member of a party. She would go to party rallies, but she was never on the forefront. Raymonda is political. She's a political animal to her polished fingernails, and she's the Jane Fonda of the country. And that's her daughter became like that, and that's the main reason her daughter ended up marrying Yasser Arafat. Just this political instinct they all share. So the two women clash because there's a fundamental difference in their approach to the conflict. Raymonda thinks that the leaders have to sit down and draft an agreement and build institutions that can create justice for the Palestinians and security for the Israelis. That's what she believes in. Ruth believes in that, but she thinks primarily the people have to meet together, they have to know each other, they have to work together. We have to overcome barriers and boundaries. So they have that clash of personalities, but at the same time, they agree on the big picture. The big picture is the Holy Land is a mosaic of peoples. It cannot be separated like a cleaver into a purely Jewish state and a purely Palestinian state. It can't be done. Mm-hmm. Theoretically, maybe it seems like a good idea, but in practice, it just can't be done. It's impossible. So they agree on that, and they realize that different approaches, a different paradigm has to be adopted by the peoples. Otherwise, the conflicts will go on and on and on. Just yesterday, two Israelis were killed in the West Bank, not far from where I was. In fact, it was a shooting instance. So the Israelis blocked all the borders. It took me 2 hours to get across the border because all the checkpoints were closed. I mean, that kind of thing happens all the time, and it leads to more tension. It leads to these periodic explosions where there's a lot of loss of life. and there's even deepening anger, but also mistrust and fear. And both women are, they've devoted their lives to finding a better way.
Now, what is their view now about this? Because as I would think you would get older and a lot wiser, of course, through experience, that you might look back and say, okay, I didn't see things quite that way before, but I now see them this way. What is their attitude toward this whole thing?
Well, I think it's reinforced what they've always believed. Raymonda was a small girl when she learned her main lessons in life. And she was, first of all, as a woman, as a girl who lost everything, raised almost as an orphan by nuns. She was taught by her nuns to speak Hebrew and to look at the Jewish girls who are also in the convent, strangely enough, as her sisters. And she was taught to love the Jewish people and to understand why they're in Israel, what happened in Europe. One book they all read in the convent was Anne Frank's diary. So she had that early on, and that was then greatly deepened by a priest who gave her her life's mission. The priest, when she was 16, told her that her mission was to fight against hatred in the Holy Land. And in a way, when I look at this, and I've studied this conflict too much, I've spent a lot of time here, and I've been through several wars. I was in Gaza right before the war last year, and I think that attitude is actually very realistic because it's the only thing that's going to work. And so the bloodshed that is constantly spilt here and the ongoing appalling events of Syria, I think has made these women even more firmly entrenched in their belief that only the human encounter beyond slogans and beyond nationalistic nostrums can bring a change to the conflict here. So, in that sense, I call that wisdom.
Interestingly enough, just a few days ago, I was talking with a woman on the East Coast about the potential Muslim invasion, if you want to call it that, here in the United States. They're having a lot of problems, in Europe with these people who are coming into their country and basically, saying we're going to live our ways and by our laws and not obey any of the laws that you folks here live by, that sort of a thing. And they, I guess there's this belief that they're beginning to slowly try to do this here in the United States. What she was talking about, though, that was really intriguing to me is that with the Muslims, their belief in religion and politics are intertwined, so they're the same. They're not separate. And, you take a look at this situation here, and, these two women see the obvious way peace can be garnered here, but yet you throw politics and religion into the mix that are intertwined, and you see how difficult, especially as you were saying earlier in the program, for the men to be able to come to terms and say, this is starting to get to be a lot of nonsense.
Yeah. Well, look, when you have a fixation, be it religious or political, and you're not willing to budge from it, it's very difficult to sit down with someone who's different than you and come to terms with that person, just because you have ideas that are blocking that. Now, I take a more nuanced view than the woman you talked about. I think I'm not going to go into the European issue or American, but in terms of what's happening here, the most peaceful city in Palestine and Israel, I think, is Nazareth, where I am right now. And Nazareth is a mixed city of Jews and Palestinian Muslims and Christians. The Muslims probably make up the largest percentage. But the Palestinians here, because this is an Israeli Arab city, they speak Hebrew. I can walk into stores and speak Hebrew with them, and there's no fear. There's no sense of hostility against me at all. And in fact, there's a real sense of being welcome because there's so many Israelis coming here, and spending so much time here. It's the intermingling of people, I think, that helps eliminate this fear, and it's not therefore it's not determined by religion. It's really a fact of human interaction. When people have no interaction, let's say Muslims outside of Paris are cut off from French society and no interaction with the French, well, yeah, it's going to reinforce the sense of separation.
Right.
Once they go to universities and they have careers and they have friends who are outside of their own community, inevitably they're going to assimilate. Mm-hmm. That's what people do everywhere. And Israel is a great example of assimilation, mm-hmm. of different peoples coming together and adopting basic rules of behavior, a common language, and having their own private identities, and that they cling to and they're very proud of, and yet it doesn't prevent them from reaching out and engaging the other.
See, and I think that's what makes a book like yours important, because I think that in America we get this view of what is possibly happening. And to give you an idea, just yesterday, I live in Portland, Oregon, there was a gunman who happened to be a Muslim, decided to go to a college down in southern Oregon and shoot the place up and left 10 dead. And he, was claimed to have been Muslim and claimed that he was after Christians and that this was jihad. And so when you see things like that and then people listen to or watch what's happening overseas in your area, they become very confused about what the potential motivation is of these people. But I'm also of the thought, just like you, that if people are given opportunities and, as you said, allowed to sort of assimilate, that really their better natures tend to come out than they normally would if they're being cut off or divided.
Yeah, I was just in Queens, and Queens is, where I was in Queens, it's mostly Pakistani and Indian, and mostly Muslims, a few Irish, just very Asian, and extremely peaceful. People don't lock the doors. Unlike 40 years ago in New York, where everyone locked 10 locks, and that neighborhood was all white.
Right.
So, I think it's good to look at the counterexamples and see how much collaboration there is. Obviously, there are a few screwballs who are going to let out their pathologies and do violent things, especially if they have ready access to a gun. But that doesn't mean that DNA is equally distributed throughout his or her population. Of course not. That's like a drunk driver who runs off the road and runs into a school bus doesn't prevent us from getting in the car the next morning and driving to work. We realize, we factor craziness into our everyday lives. We realize it's an anomaly. It shouldn't impact our daily lives. And the same thing is true with terrorism. There are anomalies, and the government very often uses anomalies to stir up hysteria for whatever Machiavellian reasons the government may have. But the fact is, most people, if given the chance, are going to be peaceful. I don't care if it's in Pakistan or it's in Israel or it's in Southern California. People, we just don't like getting our eyes torn out. We just don't like it.
Right.
Most people want their kids to go to school and be treated with respect and equality. What is lacking in most of the world is not this basic instinct of collaboration. What's lacking is a government structure that encourages collaboration and openness. Now, what we have in Israel and Palestine is we have separate governments that encourage separation, and that's going to perpetuate the conflict. If there could be a governing body that would sort of coordinate the state of Israel and the state of Palestine and find ways of peaceful ways of the people actually working together, believe me, there'd be a rapid transformation of this country, and it would be a paragon of collaboration and creativity and growth and dynamism.
So as you were growing up, did you imagine you would see yourself in a situation like this?
Well, it's funny. I come from New Mexico.
New Mexico, of all places.
And well, you know, this place reminds me a lot of New Mexico because when I didn't experience it directly. When my father was young, like his parents spoke Spanish mainly, and he was embarrassed at it. There was a lot of ethnic, racial conflict in Albuquerque at the time. This is in the 40s and 50s, 50s, let's say, gang fights, and he had 18 friends who were either killed or sent to jail when, by the time he went to the Marines, and that's his background. And so I was raised with all these stories and tales, and from uncles and aunts and my father, and time in Albuquerque. So it's conflict was everywhere, and but also there was a rich sense of identity and history, and an old Spanish Sephardic family. So there was a mixture of dire threat at the same time of a real rich rootedness that I felt, and I still feel in New Mexico. And when I come here, I kind of feel at home because there are a lot of conflicts that are similar. A lot of the ethnic conflicts have parallels. In some ways, New Mexico is more dangerous, more violent in some ways. You don't have muggings. You don't have random shootings in Israel or Palestine. You can walk through, as I did last year, you can walk through a refugee camp in Gaza without watching your back because no one's going to touch it. And so the answer is, of course, I never imagined doing this sort of thing, but it doesn't surprise me that I'm attracted to these kinds of stories because it reminds me a bit of home.
Well, certainly for the listeners out there who tend to get a lot of their information through news bites and maybe slight internet researches, this would be a book that would be good for a lot of people to come to know what's really happening, and that it's possible that peace can occur because there's actually more peace, it sounds like, you're experiencing than anything else. But you do have the anomalies, as you were talking about.
Yeah, I've walked past bus bombings where terrorists have just killed a dozen people. I've seen last year during the Gaza war, rockets were overhead and people were falling on their faces in the pavement out of fear. So it's not as if I haven't seen the conflict and I'm not aware of it. I taught in a Palestinian school in a university, and a lot of my students had fathers or uncles who have been in prison their entire lives, and some of my students were members of Hamas, and they knew where I came from. They knew a little bit about me, but it didn't prevent us from having a good teacher-student relationship and even a friendship. So, yeah, one thing I think I would like readers to get out of the book is that the world is very complex but a marvelous place, and when we open our eyes, we realize that it's much bigger than our cliches and slogans, and people are bigger than that too. Mm-hmm. And there are multiple ways of solving conflicts. Shooting at each other or building a wall, they're only the simplest. But the simplest ones that simple-minded people, and excuse me for saying this, but mostly men tend to seek, whereas the more complex, nuanced, spiritually and intellectually challenging approaches very often are adopted by women, at least in my experience, and especially with these two women. And they can show us things that usually we don't see.
Mm-hmm. It's too bad that sometimes in some parts of the world that they didn't adopt the Native American approach to a matriarchal society. I remember when...
Tragic.
Yeah, the Pilgrims first came to the United States or North America. The first thing the Indians said to them was, well, where are the women? And they misunderstood that, as being, well, you're interested in raping and stealing our women, when in fact they were trying to say, where are your leaders?
Exactly.
Pretty interesting approach there, and it's the same way in South America as well, so...
Yeah, just imagine what the world would look like if we would have listened to the wise natives and said to ourselves, look, we're going to sit at your feet a while and figure out how you do things, because clearly what we're doing in Europe isn't working. Right. That's why we're here. And,
the book is An Improbable Friendship, and our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, Anthony David. Is there a website people can find out more?
Well, I have a website. It's TonyDavidWriter.com.
Okay.
And there's a bit about this book and the reviews. There's also a very good BBC television vignette done recently on the two women, so you can see their faces. You can easily find it on the BBC site, just Raymonda Tawil or Ruth Dayan, the BBC. But it's really nice because you see them together. They were in Malta about 3 weeks ago, and the BBC and CBS both went there to meet them, and based on the book, to ask them questions and to try to puzzle out the mystery of their friendships. But to read about them is one thing, and I'm a writer and I believe in the written word, but to actually see them is something very special. So that's also on my website. People can have access to that link.
Well, very good. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us here on the program today, and very exciting. I'll be excited to finish reading the book. It was quite intense but very enjoyable. I kind of thought things were different than we're being told at times. And it's always enjoyable to have a guest like you on the show that really kind of sheds the light and really shows you what's going on.
Well, it's been delightful to talk, and I thank you so much.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Be sure to join us at our website at Beyond50Radio.com. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter as well. You can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio, as well as like us on Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past